session to vote on extending the Patriot Act as well as a new domestic surveillance reform bill. At midnight tonight, 3 key provisions of the Patriot Act are set to expire. Section 215, which allows the NSA to collect and store telephone metadata on millions of Americans, the use of roving wiretaps to track terrorist suspects who frequently change their communication devices, their cell phones, and the so-called lone wolf provision, which allows the surveillance of someone who is not connected to a known terror group. But Senator and Republican presidential candidate Rand Paul is vowing to block extension of the Patriot Act and any other legislation that fails to end the government's domestic data collection program. Joining me now is Republican Senator Mike Lee. He is sponsoring the new surveillance reform bill that the Senate will take up later today, and as well Senator Angus King, who has some concerns, serious concerns, with the proposed legislation. I want to begin, if I can, with Senator Lee. Senator Lee, as we look at this legislation, we're coming down to the wire here. Do you believe you have the votes to get this passed tonight so that those powers that we just described aren't suspended?
I do believe we have the votes. And so at this point, I think the question is not really about whether we'll get this passed, but when. It'll happen either tonight or it'll happen on Wednesday or sometime in between then. But really within that 72-hour window, we are going to pass the House-passed USA Freedom Act, which passed the House with a bipartisan supermajority of 338 votes. This is a good day for the American people, whose rights will be protected, whose Fourth Amendment and privacy interests will be defended. At the same time, their national security interests will also be protected and preserved.
But 72 hours, that would still provide a window where these powers are suspended. And as the president described when he was making the case on Friday, even a short window, considering the level of the threat from groups such as ISIS, etc., would provide an opportunity, a danger. Are you saying that even if you have the votes, that there will be a period where these powers are suspended?
I hope not. I think that would be unfortunate, and I think it would be unnecessary. That's why I'd like to get it passed today. I will point out, I tried to bring this up early last week because I recognized that this cliff was coming. We've known for 4 years that this deadline was approaching, and I think the American people are starting to demand more. They're starting to expect that Congress actually moves ahead of the game and stops governing by cliff. The American people deserve better than this, especially when it comes to a program that's an integral part of protecting our national security.
So how did we get to this cliff? You know, it's not a budget showdown, it's a national security showdown. How did we get here?
Well, we've known it was coming for the last 4 years. Several of us had concerns starting the last time this program was reauthorized 4 years ago. We voted against it, and we began working on a process to reform Section 215 of the Patriot Act. You know, I felt strongly about this for a long time, so much so that I devoted an entire chapter of my new book, Our Lost Constitution, to this program and to its ramifications for the Fourth Amendment and for the privacy interests of the American people. But that's why we came up with this bill. And we proposed this bill last year so that it could be introduced and passed well in advance of this deadline. Unfortunately, this sort of thing has become all too common. It's been a trend and a bad habit adopted by both parties. Bad habits, old habits, sometimes die hard, but this is an idea and a habit whose time has finally come. I think it's time for us to move forward and to stop governing by cliff.
Well, and it's a habit now that has the country's ability to counter terrorism in its sights. Rand Paul, as you know, is preparing for a fight. He's saying he will block this legislation. You backed him when he held the floor for 10 hours. You even stepped in for him when he was on the floor. Are you prepared to do the same tonight in light of the concerns he still holds?
Senator Paul and I share similar concerns about the collection of bulk metadata. We think it's wrong for the government to be collecting phone records on every single American's phone calls. We do differ as to the strategy for how to deal with it. And so, although he and I share a similar concern, I don't agree with his approach, and I've taken a different approach here. I think the USA Freedom Act solves the underlying problem.
But let me ask you this finally before I let you go. When this program, the bulk metadata program, was revealed through Edward Snowden, the administration first claimed that there were some 50 terror plots that had been blocked due to that metadata collection. That number was watered down. That talking point disappeared. Senator Pat Leahy and others established that, well, in fact, it was just one plot, $8,500 going from an American to Al-Shabaab, that was directly connected to information collected in the phone metadata program. Now, the fact is, the government under this proposal won't hold the data anymore, but the phone companies will. I mean, the data is still getting collected. Why is it necessary?
Well, the phone companies will hold the records because they're the phone companies. They have a record of who calls whom. And so the NSA will be able to query and reach out to the phone companies to get that calling data that's relevant to an actual national security investigation. But we don't think it's a good idea for the government to just be collecting all this data in bulk just because it's there. This data, when aggregated and when put into a database that covers a 5-year period of time, potentially 300 million Americans, it reveals a lot about a person, about how they spend their time. And we don't think it's appropriate for the government to just collect this information simply because it exists.